Hello, it's me, Kent Kentley. We're going to finish the Chessmen of Doom. We're on the 16th chapter. As usual, I like to pop in and say hello. As you can see, I am surviving long-haired and shaggy-bearded as I am this terrible pandemic, and I hope that you and all you love are surviving as well, and these books are bringing you some level of pleasure. I always like a kind hello. I won't say mash that like and subscribe button because it doesn't necessarily help me at all, and this is for fun, not for money. So, to finish, Chapter 16 of the Chessmen of Doom by John Bellairs. The adventure was supposed to be over, but it wasn't. The boys went back to their normal lives in Dustin Heights. And as the months passed, they heard bits and pieces of news. The estate of Stone Arabia had been sold to a real estate developer who wanted to build houses on the land. The professor had lost his chance at the $10 million, but he had gotten $20,000 as a consolation prize. The body of Mr. Stallybrass had been found, horribly mutilated in the Kennebec River. The body of Perry Childermass had not been found, and the police had given up the search. Then one day in April, the professor announced to the boys that he was going to England to return the chessmen, and he was inviting them to go along. They would leave in June as soon as school was out. The boys were delighted. "I thought you were going to send the chessmen back in a little box and not say who they were from," said Johnny. Patiently, the professor explained he had consulted legal authorities and they had assured him that he wouldn't be prosecuted if he brought them back. In fact, the British Museum was offering a reward of £3,000 for their safe return, and that would be more than enough to pay for a trip to London for the professor and the two boys. One sunny day in June, the old man and his friends were standing before the pompous doorway of the British Museum. After snapping a picture of Fergie and Johnny in front of the fluted Greek columns of the entrance, the professor led the way in. They spent a couple of hours gawking at the treasures, Egyptian statues and Assyrian winged bulls, rows of Egyptian mummies, and clocks and curios of all sorts. Finally, they came to the room where the chessmen were kept under glass. Hesitantly, Johnny and Fergie approached the display case. They were fearful without really knowing why. Johnny kept telling himself that the chessmen were perfectly harmless now, but a lot of nagging doubts remained in his mind. These odd little objects had been used in a ritual that nearly destroyed the world. Mr. Stallybrass was dead, but maybe another sorcerer would know how to use the chessmen. The professor glanced sharply at Johnny, and he read his thoughts. "Worried, John?" he said in a taunting voice. "Are you afraid that the little beggars will come crawling out of their glass case and do a tango in the middle of the floor?" Johnny stared sullenly at the floor. "Oh, come on, Professor," he grumbled. "Stop making fun of me. If you really want to know, yeah, I am worried, because maybe there might be another copy somewhere of that magic ritual that Mr. Stallybrass tried to use." The professor shook his head firmly. "No, John," he said, "I do not think it is possible. That magic book that we burned was done by hand, before printing was invented. The chances of there being another one like it are, well, I would say 1,000,000 to 1 against." Johnny seemed a bit reassured, but Fergie was still skeptical. Besides, he liked taking the unpopular side in any argument. "How can you say 1,000,000 to 1, Prof?" he asked. "Is that just some set of odds that you made up in your sleep, or did you really work the problem out?" The professor stiffened, and it was clear he was struggling to keep from losing his temper. But just as he was about to say a few sarcastic words to Fergie, something happened. A short, odd-looking man in a derby hat entered the room, and he approached the display case where the chessmen were. He wore an incredibly dirty and threadbare tweed overcoat, and his long, unwashed hair hung down over his collar. His nose was red and bulbous, and half-moon reading glasses were stuck askew on his face. He held a pad and a pencil, and as the professor and the boys watched, he began jotting down notes. Aghast, the professor stared. He made a few strangled sounds in his throat, but nothing came out. Finally, he motioned for the boys to come away. Before long, they were studying Roman artifacts in another room. "Who do you think that guy was, Prof?" asked Fergie after they had paused to sit down on a padded bench. "Some lunatic," snapped the professor. "England is famous for its eccentrics, and he may well be one of the weirder ones." "But why was he taking notes about the chessmen?" asked Johnny in a worried voice. "What's he up to?" The professor shrugged and looked crabby. "How the dickens would I know, John? Sometimes I think that you boys want me to be the world's greatest genius who can explain the meaning of the universe to you. Look, when I returned the chessmen last week, a lot of reporters were there at the ceremony. The Times of London and a lot of other papers covered the event. Probably this guy has been assigned to write some sort of follow-up article. Now, do you suppose we can change the subject? Let's talk about Roman villas in Britain. or Bodici's revolt, or something. Johnny and Fergie shrugged. They followed the professor to yet another room full of treasures. About half an hour later, the three of them stepped out into the columned porch in front of the museum. It was late afternoon, and crowds of people were milling around, snapping photos or just chatting. With a sigh of contentment, the professor reached into an inside pocket of his suit coat and took out a black cardboard case that was emblazoned with a Russian eagle. He plucked a black and gold Balkan Sobrane cigarette from the box, lit it, and blew a stream of smoke into the air. Now he launched into a boring speech about how polite the British police were, and that they should act polite so the British would respect them. Suddenly the professor noticed the little derby-hatted man had set up shop in the courtyard in front of the museum. He had a wooden folding table with stacks of leaflets on it. As the professor watched, tourists paused in front of the table and examined the leaflets and bought them. A wooden bowl on the table was full of shillings, sixpences, and even pound notes. The little man seemed very pleased. His leaflets were selling like hotcakes. With a sudden snort of indignation, the professor ground his cigarette under his heel and stalked off toward the table. After giving the man a nasty look, he snatched a leaflet from the pile and read the front page. Secrets of the Ancient Chessmen, a study of the mysterious ivory chessmen found over a century ago on the Isle of Lewis. Why were they stolen and returned? Were they originally in the Great Pyramid? Can they be used to unlock the mysteries of Stonehenge? Why have the authorities tried to hide the importance of these occult objects, which may at one time have been buried on Mars, placed there by beings from outer space? Learn the truth as it has been found out. By Murgatroyd Friel, Ph.D. Can you afford to neglect this earth-shaking book? For a full minute, the professor glared at the table full of leaflets. His face got redder and redder, and he scrunched the paper in his fist. Then he exploded with a blood-curdling yell. He kicked over the table and wildly threw handfuls of leaflets in all directions. "You horn-swoggling charlatan!" he screeched, as the little frightened man backed further and further away. "Get out of here! I'll have the law on you, so help me I will!" As the boys watched, the professor chased the little man toward the gate and the tall iron fence that surrounded the museum's grounds. Near the gate, a couple of blue uniformed guards grabbed the professor and led him struggling back into the courtyard. The crowd of tourists who had enjoyed the spectacle let out a mighty cheer, and the professor would have tipped his hat if his arms had been free. Instead, he smiled weakly and nodded as the guards gave him a severe talking to. Finally, he was released. The officers told him he was not going to be charged with anything as long as he left the museum grounds immediately and did not come back. With a sheepish grin, the professor led the boys out into Great Russell Street. They turned left and headed toward their hotel. As they walked along, Fergie could not resist making a comment. "What was it you said before, Prof?" he asked with an innocent smile. "I mean, that stuff about being polite with the British. I'd like to hear some more of that." The professor dug his hands into his pockets. "Just zip your lip, Byron," he grumped. "You should learn to keep quiet until spoken to." Johnny said nothing, but he silently told himself that this was going to be a very interesting vacation, if they managed to survive it. And you will hear more about Johnny and Fergie and the Professor in England in The Secret of the Underground Room, which will be the next book that I will read. But that is the end of the Chessmen of Doom, and I will see you next time.